You know, life has a funny way of teaching you lessons. Sometimes those lessons come in small inconveniences, like a flat tire or a misplaced bill. Other times, they come like a freight train, barreling straight at you when you least expect it. For me, that train came in the form of my neighborhood's Homeowners Association, an HOA that thought they could bully me, embarrass me, and even take my home all over a measly $200. But before I get into how this whole mess spiraled out of control, okay, and how I ended up holding the mortgage debt of every single board member who tried to ruin me, let me start from the beginning. Because trust me, you won't believe how petty and ruthless these people were, and how sweet it felt to turn the tables on them in the end. I moved into my neighborhood a few years ago. It was a quiet, family-friendly area with neatly trimmed lawns, freshly painted fences, and streets so clean you'd think the mayor himself walked them every morning. I remember being excited about the place, thinking it was the perfect spot to settle down. The houses looked great, the neighbors seemed nice enough, and on the surface, everything appeared peaceful. Of course, no one tells you that behind every manicured lawn and smiling neighbor, there's an HOA board lurking in the shadows, watching your every move, waiting for you to slip up. And in my neighborhood, they were ruthless. The kind of people who lived for the thrill of sending out violation letters and fining residents for the smallest infractions. A trash bin left out too long, a lawn growing half an inch taller than regulation, or a car parked a few inches too far onto the street didn't matter. They fined people left and right, like it was their sole mission in life. At first, I played by their rules. I kept my yard tidy, followed their parking regulations, even went to a couple of their meetings just to understand how things worked. But eventually, like most homeowners, I slipped up. I missed a payment. Not even a full HOA fee, just a late fee of $200 after I'd already paid my regular dues. I thought, no big deal, I'll get around to it next month. Big mistake. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. The envelope was thick, stamped with the HOA's logo. I opened it up and nearly laughed at how dramatic it was. In bold red letters across the top, it said, "Notice of violation and delinquency." Inside, they laid it out plain and simple. The $200 plus a late penalty or face further action. Now let me pause here for a second. Any normal organization, any decent group of people would have just given me a polite reminder, maybe even a phone call. But not my HOA. No, they acted like I had personally committed a crime against humanity, and it didn't stop there. Every week after that, I got more letters. The fines piled up $50 here, $75 there all because I hadn't paid the original $200 on time. By the time a month passed, that $200 had ballooned into nearly $600, and the threats got uglier. Words like foreclosure and lien on your property started showing up. They were threatening to take my house over less than the cost of a new smartphone. At first, I was angry. Then, I was scared. Because I knew HOAs had power. I'd heard horror stories of people losing their homes over petty fees, their entire lives upended because of a power-hungry board. And it looked like they were setting their sights on me next. So I did what anyone would. I called them. I figured maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. Maybe if I explained, if I told them I'd pay the $200 plus whatever late fee they wanted, they'd back off. I dialed the number listed on the letter, waded through the robotic menu, and finally got through to the HOA president, a woman named Linda. I'll never forget that conversation. "Hello, this is Linda with the HOA board. How can I help you?" she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Yes, hi. I just got your letter about the late fee. I know I missed it, and I want to make it right. I'll pay the $200 plus whatever penalty I owe." She cut me off before I could even finish. "Oh no, sir. Doesn't work like that. You see, Your account has already been referred to our legal department. You now owe the full balance of $675, plus attorney fees, plus processing charges. That's a total of $925. And if you don't pay by the end of the month, we'll have no choice but to initiate foreclosure proceedings. I just sat there in stunned silence, gripping the phone. Foreclosure? Over $900. My mortgage payment alone was more than that. It felt like a sick joke. Wait a minute, I said, trying to keep calm. You're telling me you'd take my house over a late fee? I'm offering to pay what I owe right now, but you'd rather drag this out and threaten foreclosure. Her voice hardened. We have rules for a reason, sir. If you can't follow them, perhaps this neighborhood isn't the right fit for you. Click. She hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, my blood boiling. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about money, it was about power. They wanted to make an example out of me, to scare the rest of the neighborhood into obedience. And I wasn't going to let them win. That night, I poured myself a strong cup of coffee, sat down at my computer, and started researching. If they wanted to play games, I was ready to play, too. And little did I know, the rabbit hole I was about to go down would lead me to the ultimate revenge. Because by the time this was all over, the same people threatening to take my house would be answering to me. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind was racing, going over every word Linda had said on the phone. The arrogance in her tone, the way she brushed me off like I was some delinquent, it lit a fire in me. I knew I had two choices. Either roll over and let them bully me, or fight back with everything I had. And I've never been much of a quitter, so I started digging. I read every line of the HOA bylaws, combed through homeowner rights forums, and spent hours on legal websites. What I found only confirmed my worst fears. Yes, HOAs really do have the power to foreclose on your home even for a few $100s in unpaid dues or fees. It sounded insane, but it was legal in my state. People had lost their houses over as little as a few missed payments. Their equity wiped out in an instant. But then, in my late-night research, I stumbled onto something interesting. HOA boards themselves weren't untouchable. They had their own financial responsibilities, their own debts. And those debts? They were often tied to their personal mortgages, which in many cases were public record. That's when the first spark of an idea came to me. If they could come after my home for $200, what would happen if I flipped the script? What if I put myself in a position where I had power over them? It sounded crazy, sure. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I just needed to figure out how to make it work. The next morning, I went about my day like nothing had happened. I waved at neighbors, mowed my lawn, even chatted with old Mr. Jenkins across the street about his rose garden. But underneath, I was simmering. Every time I saw one of the board members' homes, I thought about Linda's smug voice on the phone. I thought about the letters piling up in my mailbox. I promised myself I was going to make them regret. Ever picking a fight with me, the letters didn't stop. If anything, they came faster. One envelope after another, threatening fines, liens, legal action. Each one was designed to intimidate, to wear me down until I caved. But I didn't. I kept them all in a neat stack on my desk, like trophies. Reminders of the war one was fighting. Meanwhile, I doubled down on my research. I learned how mortgage debt was bought and sold between banks. How private investors could purchase loans that were in default. And how those loans gave the holder significant leverage over the homeowner. It wasn't easy reading half the time. I felt like I needed a law degree just to understand it, but slowly I pieced it together, and then came the breakthrough. One evening, I was scanning through county property records when I came across something that made me stop cold. It was Linda's house, the HOA president herself. And right there, in plain text, was her mortgage information. She wasn't just in debt, she was behind on her payments. I leaned back in my chair, grinning for the first time in weeks. If the president of the HOA was this vulnerable, what about the others? I stayed up until sunrise that night, pulling every record I could find. One by one, I looked up the addresses of the board members, the treasurer, the secretary, the vice president. And one by one, I discovered they weren't as untouchable as they liked to pretend. 2 of them had refinanced their homes multiple times, racking up massive debt. Another had a second mortgage he was barely keeping afloat. It was like striking gold. These people who were threatening to take my house. They were living in glass houses themselves, and I had just found the stones. I started making calls. I reached out to contacts, investors, even a couple of lawyers. At first, everyone told me the same thing. It's complicated. It's expensive. It's not worth it. But I didn't care. I wasn't thinking about money anymore. I was thinking about justice, about revenge, and slowly, piece by piece, the plan started coming together. A few weeks later, I walked into the HOA meeting like nothing was wrong. They were all there, Linda at the head of the table, smug as ever, surrounded by her little army of board members. I could feel their eyes on me as I sat down in the back, clutching the stack of letters they'd sent me. "Ah, Mr. Thompson," Linda said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Here to finally pay your dues?" I didn't answer. I just smiled. Because what they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that I had already set the wheels in motion. And very soon, the balance of power in this neighborhood was going to shift forever. The HOA meeting that night was like every other one I had sat through before long. Boring and filled with self-important speeches from people who loved the sound of their own voices. Linda lectured us about community standards, the treasurer droned on about budgets and future projects, and the rest of the board nodded like puppets on strings. But I wasn't really listening. Not this time. I was watching, studying their faces, their smug expressions, the way they looked at homeowners who dared to ask questions. The board carried themselves like they were kings and queens ruling over peasants. And I sat there in the back row, smiling quietly to myself. Because I knew something they didn't. When the meeting finally wrapped up, Linda announced, "Before we close, I'd like to address one final matter. Delinquent accounts. We have a homeowner in violation who continues to ignore notices and refuses to pay what is owed. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to spread in our community." Her eyes flicked toward me, and the room went quiet. A few neighbors turned to glance in my direction. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice sharp, "you have until the end of the month to settle your balance, or the board will be forced to proceed with foreclosure. This community deserves members who respect the rules." I leaned back in my chair, smiled, and said, "Duly noted." Then I walked out. They thought they had embarrassed me, but inside, I was laughing. Because while Linda was busy playing Queen of the Cul-de-sac, was finalizing paperwork with a debt acquisition company, paperwork that would soon make me the owner of her mortgage note. The process wasn't simple. It took weeks of negotiation, back and forth with the bank, and more than a few sleepless nights worrying whether it would actually go through. But finally, one sunny morning, I got the email I had been waiting for. "Congratulations," it read. "Transfer of mortgage note complete." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. It was official. I now owned Linda's mortgage debt. The HOA president who had been threatening me with foreclosure now technically owed me. But I didn't stop there. No. Once I had a taste of that power, I wanted more. I kept digging, kept buying. One by one, I acquired the debt of the other board members. Some were smaller amounts, some were substantial, but the effect was the same. Piece by piece, I built a quiet empire right under their noses. And the best part? They had no idea. To the HOA board, I was still just the stubborn homeowner refusing to pay a petty fee. They didn't know that behind the scenes, every check they wrote, every payment they struggled to make, was lining my pockets. I remember the first time Linda called me after missing a payment. She didn't know it was me on the other end of the paperwork. She just knew she was late and needed to talk to her new lender. I kept my voice calm, professional, never revealing my identity. But inside, I was grinning ear to ear. The woman who had laughed at me on the phone was now scrambling to explain why she was behind on her bills. It was poetic justice. Meanwhile, the HOA kept pushing forward with their threats against me. More letters, more fines, more intimidation. They were so busy gloating over my supposed downfall that they didn't even notice the ground, crumbling beneath their own feet. Then came the day everything collided. It was another HOA meeting. I showed up early this time, sat right in the front row, and waited. The board members filed in, looking tired, stressed, but still trying to keep up their holier-thump-out act. Linda started the meeting as usual, but her confidence seemed a little shaken. Her voice cracked as she went through the agenda, and I could see the beads of sweat forming on her forehead. When it came time for delinquent accounts, she once again called me out. Mr. Thompson still refuses to pay his outstanding balance. We've exhausted every option and we'll be moving forward with foreclosure proceedings. I raised my hand. Actually, I said calmly, I think we need to talk about something else first. The room went quiet. All eyes turned toward me. Linda scowled. This isn't your time to speak, Mr. Thompson. Oh, I think it is, I replied, reaching into my folder. I pulled out a stack of documents and placed them neatly on the table in front of her. Because while you've been busy threatening me, I've been busy too. And what I've discovered changes everything. She frowned, glancing at the papers. What is this? That, I said, leaning back in my chair, is proof that I now own your mortgage debt. And not just yours, Linda. The treasurers, the secretaries, even the vice presidents. You see, while you've been threatening to take my house over $200, I've been buying up the very roofs over your heads. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Linda's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The other board members scrambled to look at the documents, their hands shaking. The power dynamic shifted in an instant. I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. So here's how it's going to go. You're going to drop all actions against me immediately. You're going to rescind every fine, every penalty, every threat. And from this moment forward, this HOA is going to operate fairly aware, else the people running it might just find themselves without a home to go back to. And just like that, the balance of power shifted forever. The look on their faces that night was something I'll never forget. Linda, the woman who had once spoken to me with smug superiority, sat frozen in her chair, staring at the papers like they were a death sentence. The treasurer nervously tugged. At his collar, the secretary's hands shook so hard she could barely flip through the documents. And the vice president just slumped back, pale as a ghost. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Neighbors, who had been sitting quietly as spectators, leaned forward, whispering to one another. You could feel it in the air, the shift. The aura of control the board had always carried was gone, stripped away in a single moment. Finally, Linda tried to compose herself. This is outrageous, she stammered. You can't possibly. I cut her off. I can, and I did. Every payment you've been struggling to make, every past due notice you've been trying to ignore those, all come through me now. So the way I see it, you've got two choices. Resign from this board and drop every action against me, or keep pushing me and risk losing your homes. The decision is yours. Gasps rippled through the room. A few neighbors even chuckled under their breath, clearly enjoying seeing the mighty board finally squirm. The treasurer leaned over to Linda, whispering frantically, but I caught a few words. "He's not bluffing. Look at the signatures." Linda's face tightened. She looked at me like she wanted to claw my eyes out, but deep down, she knew the truth. She was trapped. They all were. The meeting ended abruptly that night. No further business, no smug lectures about community standards, just a flustered announcement that the board will reconvene privately to discuss this matter. They shuffled out like beaten dogs, avoiding eye contact with me or anyone else. I walked home that night feeling lighter than I had in months. For once, I wasn't the one being threatened. I wasn't the one living in fear of a foreclosure letter. They were. But this wasn't just about me anymore. Oh no, this was bigger. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next morning, I couldn't walk down the street without someone stopping me. People clapped me on the back, whispered, "Good job," and shared their own horror stories about the HOA. Late fees, ridiculous fines. Harassment was like. The floodgates had opened, and everyone finally felt safe enough to speak up. "Did you really buy their mortgages?" One neighbor asked in disbelief. "Every last one," I said with a smile. The funny thing was, I hadn't planned on becoming some kind of neighborhood hero. At first, this was all about revenge, about making them pay for what they tried to do to me. But now I realized I was in a position to change things for everyone. The board tried to hold another meeting a week later, but it was a disaster. Half the neighborhood showed up, angry and emboldened. Homeowners who had been quiet for years now stood up and demanded answers. Why had they been fined for stupid things? Where was all the money going? And why were board members hiding their own financial troubles while lording power over everyone else? The board had no answers. They sat there, red-faced and humiliated, while neighbor after neighbor unloaded on them. Finally, Linda slammed her gavel down, her voice cracking as she shouted, "This meeting is adjourned." But it was too late. The people had spoken. Within days, petitions circulated calling for a vote to remove the board entirely. And when the vote came, it wasn't even close. Nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood signed to kick them out. I'll never forget the look on Linda's face as she packed up her papers and stormed out of the clubhouse for the last time. All her power, all her arrogance gone in a flash. The board was dismantled. And in its place, we formed a new committee. One that actually listened to homeowners. One that used HOA funds for real community improvements instead of petty fines and power trips. And for the first time since moving in, the neighborhood actually felt like a community instead of a dictatorship. But the sweetest part, even after they resigned, I still owned their debts. Every month, checks from Linda and the others quietly rolled in, funneled straight to me. The very people who had tried to take my house were now, in a way, paying rent to me. It was poetic. It was perfect. And every time I walked past their houses, I smiled. Because I knew the truth. They could have left me alone. They could have accepted my $200 and moved on. But they chose war. And I finished it. The weeks after the board's collapse felt surreal. For the first time in years, I could walk through my neighborhood without feeling like someone was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. No more nasty letters in the mailbox. No more late night anxiety about foreclosure. Just peace. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now waved and smiled. People started planting gardens again, painting their fences, even holding block parties without worrying about some arbitrary fine. The neighborhood looked better than ever, not because of fear, but because people finally felt free. As for me, I kept things quiet. I never flaunted what I'd done, never boasted openly about owning the board's debts. But people knew. Word had spread far beyond our community. Friends of friends reached out, sharing their own HOA nightmares, asking me how I did it. I realized something important then. This wasn't just about me getting revenge. This was about showing that ordinary people didn't have to be powerless. And Linda? She still lived in the neighborhood, though she barely showed her face anymore. The once proud, smug president of the HOA was now just another homeowner, except one who wrote a monthly check with my name on it every time that payment cleared. I thought back to the day she told me maybe this neighborhood wasn't the right fit for me. Funny how things change. The treasurer eventually moved away, selling his house at a loss just to get out from under the debt. The secretary kept her head down, too embarrassed to even make eye contact when we passed each other on the street. The vice president, he avoided me entirely, like I was a ghost haunting his every step, but I didn't need to rub it in. The victory was already mine. One evening, I sat on my porch, sipping a cold drink, watching kids ride their bikes up and down the street. The air was filled with laughter and the smell of fresh barbecue from a neighbor's grill. For the first time since I'd moved here, the place actually felt like home. I thought back to that first letter I'd gotten, the one that said "Notice of Violation" in big red letters. I thought about the fear, the anger, the helplessness. And I realized how close I had come to losing everything over something so small. But instead of losing, I fought back. And in doing so, I had turned the tables completely. That's the thing about power. It only works if people let it. My HOA thought they had all the power, but in reality, they were just as vulnerable as anyone else. All it took was someone willing to push back, to dig a little deeper, to play their game better than they could. So if there's a lesson in all of this, simple. Never underestimate the person you try to bully, because the very person you push down today might be the one holding your future in their hands tomorrow. To anyone out there dealing with an HOA nightmare, I know how helpless it can feel. But trust me, there's always a way to fight back. Sometimes it's through legal channels, sometimes through organizing with neighbors. And sometimes, well, sometimes you get a little creative. As for me, I don't worry about my HOA anymore. Because in the end, they tried to take my house over $200. And instead of losing my home, I ended up owning theirs. Funny how life works out. That's my story. Thanks for listening. And if you've ever had your own run-in with an HOA, share it. People need to know they're not alone. And remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting or fighting. Sometimes the best revenge is letting the bullies bury themselves, and then quietly owning everything they thought they controlled. Until next time, stay strong, stay sharp, and don't ever let anyone take your home without a fight.